So ultimately, we are talking about Bill S-12, which of course amends the criminal code, notably makes changes to the Sex Offender Information Registration Act in particular, among other things. And I'm just going to give you some background, Mr. Speaker, about how we came to this point and the history of this in Canada and why it was so important that this registry was brought forward in the first place. So certainly the Sex Offender Information Registration Act, or it's called SOIRA, was first passed by the Liberal Martin government, in fact, in 2004, with all parties supporting it. So that does happen from time to time in this place. Again, when there's a tremendous gravity of the weight of the decision, it's good to see sometimes all parties come together. And however, under Prime Minister Martin, the enrollment on the registry was at the discretion of the judge at the time. And certainly it introduced the idea that registered sex offenders were required to report annually to registration centers, as well as declare any changes of residence, travel plans, or changes in employment, and certainly were subject to police checks. And failure to comply certainly would result in fines in up to 2 years in prison, and frankly, rightfully so, in my opinion. So it really brought in that accountability and that sort of police watch on people who sexually violate other people. So a very important move forward in Canada back in 2004. However, a few years later, an enormous step forward again was made in 2011 under the Conservative Harper government, who introduced and passed Bill S-2 with unanimous support yet again in the House. Again, all parties supporting S-2 under the Conservative Harper government, which made inclusion in the registry mandatory for those convicted of any sexual offense and made inclusion for life mandatory for those convicted of multiple offenses. So under the Harper Conservative government, of course, an extra step forward to really crack down and hold accountable those who sexually violate other Canadians. And this change was very critical in the sense that it made it mandatory. The reason that was, the motivation behind that was because when it was left at judicial discretion following the 2004 Martin government's initial legislation, when it was left at judicial discretion, nearly half of all convicted sex offenders were not added to the list. So you had basically half of these sex offenders with no accountability mechanism in terms of the accountability that, as I mentioned, just outlined, was built into the registry. So very concerning, and it certainly compromised the efficacy of that registry. Again, if you only have 1 and 2 sex offenders on there, it really undermines the safety and accountability and the tools that police use all the time to ensure that we are kept safe from people like sex offenders and others. So that was a very important step forward, and again, had unanimous support in the House at the time for these very reasons. However, fast forward to this past, actually I guess it was a year ago now, October 2022, in a Supreme Court decision, R v. Nuluvu, it was determined, it struck down two areas of the Supreme Court, deemed them unconstitutional. First, it struck down the section in the Criminal Code that required mandatory registration to the sex offender registry of anyone found guilty of a sex offense. However, this was struck down in a split decision, 5-4. I'll get to that in a moment. So ultimately, this means the personal information of every sex offender must be added to Canada's National Sex Offender Registry. No longer the case. And again, it's important to remember the reason this was brought in the first place. Half of them weren't being added, but the Supreme Court struck that down. The second area of the criminal code that was struck down was the section that imposed mandatory registration for life for those that committed more than one such offense. That was struck down unanimously. Everybody on the court agreed. Mandatory addition for life was unconstitutional. And as was outlined previously, the clock is ticking on this. Unfortunately, it took the Liberal government quite a while to get this legislation through. We have about a month to get this through all stages. I'm going to guess that's going to be difficult to do. Been here for 4 years. It's pretty rare to see that happen, but we'll see if the Liberal government prioritizes it. We will find out, or they may have to ask for an extension. Because again, if it does not pass, then no one can be added to the registry at all, and that's deeply concerning. So hopefully they're doing their due diligence to make this happen, but we will find out. And again, the registry is very important as a tool for police. It's also very important to hold the sex offenders accountable. So we need to have this in there. S-12 does, however, despite the Supreme Court striking down these two areas, it does make registration automatic in a few cases. Child sex offenders sentenced to 2 or more years in prison. Also, any repeat offender who has been previously convicted of a sexual offense, and the bill also allows judges the ability to impose lifetime registration for sex offenders who are found guilty of more than one offense at the same time if the offender poses a risk of reoffending. So that's good. I'm glad that's in there. However, I'm just going to outline in brief the other cases that will not be automatically added. For example, sexual exploitation of a person with a disability, not automatically added. Sexual assault with a weapon. You sexually assault someone with a weapon, you won't be automatically added to the sex offender registry. It's very concerning. I think people should be concerned about that, especially given the court's record before where only half were added. Aggravated sexual assault with the use of a firearm. And there's a very long list of concerning circumstances where you won't necessarily be added if you violate someone like this. And I think that for me personally, I know for our party, it's deeply concerning that that could be the case given the track record before 2011. The 5-4 decision, I did want to go into that a little bit because I thought that the dissenting arguments were quite compelling. And again, this was mandatory registration. I'll just read a little bit of the minority or the dissenting opinion. I do think it's relevant to this discussion. The minority dissent argued that Parliament was pursuing a rational objective in mandating all sex offenders be included in the registry because this group of people as a whole, they argued, possesses an increased risk to reoffend. And the previous system of judicial discretion had resulted in up to 50% of sex offenders staying off the registry. The dissent went on to further argue, but in substance, they cherry-picked just one, they referring to those who struck this down on the court, they cherry-picked just one such example, an exceptional case involving an offender who was wheelchair-bound, that my colleagues can point to only a single extreme case where it was clear at the time of the sentencing that the offender did not pose an increased risk tends to prove my point, not theirs. And in conclusion, the dissent argued, in finding it unconstitutional, my colleagues fixate on the removal of judicial discretion to exempt offenders who do not pose an increased risk to reoffend. But the exercise of discretion was the very problem that prompted Parliament to amend the Criminal Code to provide for automatic registration of the sex offenders under the Sex Offender Information Registration Act. And in conclusion, they argued specifically many judges had exercised their discretion to exempt offenders in a manifestly improper manner. Again, this is the Supreme Court arguing this, at least in the dissent. And the registry's low inclusion rate undermined its efficacy. The evidence is clear that even low-risk offenders relative to the general criminal population pose a heightened risk to commit another sexual offense. It is also clear that it cannot be reliably predicted at the time of sentencing which offenders will reoffend in the face of that uncertain risk. Parliament was entitled to cast a wide net. I thought that was very compelling. I am concerned. I do appreciate the legislation seems to be doing what it can. I'm not convinced it goes far enough. I think it can go farther. We are looking to see if we can improve that throughout the stages of legislation in Parliament and in committee. And just to conclude, again, there was a reason this was mandatory. I recognize the Supreme Court decision, but as outlined in the dissent, we are talking about sex offenders and some of the most vulnerable people that they impact. We want to see legislation that can go as far as it can in light of the Supreme Court decision, and we're not quite convinced yet that we're there, and we will be looking at that very closely throughout the stages. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, and I thank the member opposite for her contribution. Mr. Speaker, I'd say that we're enacting what we believe is the strongest possible regime against sex offenders in compliance with the Supreme Court's direction. It's crucial that victims and survivors of sexual crimes can feel safe and can have confidence in our criminal justice system. What my question is to the member opposite is that we must pass this legislation quickly. It must receive royal assent before October the 28th, or else the National Sex Offender Registry will cease to function on a go-forward basis. Will my colleague opposite join me in supporting this legislation and preventing this dangerous outcome?
I almost feel like I'm talking to my child when I talk about this, and they say, "Dad, I didn't do my homework." And it's an hour before bedtime, and I have 2 hours of homework to do. And they say, "Can I stay up a little later?" And I sit there and I think, why didn't you prepare? Now, obviously, it's of critical importance that we address this. But in respect of my colleague's question, I am left with the same question. Why are we here on September 20th with an October 28th deadline? It's what, 38 days? And this government then puts it on us. This government knows that it has to go to committee. The honourable minister was the parliamentary secretary. He sat at committee for many months, if not years. He knows the routine. This has to go to committee. We first have to vote on it at second reading, and then it has to go to committee, and then it has to come back for third reading. And the government is putting it on us. We will scrutinize this bill, and I can say this, I will do everything in my power possible to ensure that we have the best possible bill in a timely manner. Thank you.
Now, here's where I give everyone the little reminder that the quicker we can ask questions, the quicker we can answer them, the more people that get to participate in, of course, this debate, because now we are out of time and we have to move on to the next speaker.